had a podcast recently, and I was speaking to a gentleman about men's mental health. And this is something that I talk about a lot on my channel because it's something that I've dealt with, and it's something that a lot of people are dealing with and sort of working around the stigma. I'm not sure if the stigma is as bad as it was. I think a lot of the stigma may be around not even seeking treatment, but like accepting that sometimes you need to make life changes. You may need to get out of a nasty environment, a nasty relationship, or you may get to the point where medication is necessary for a short period of time, a long period of time, case by case. Why are men killing themselves disproportionately to women?
Are they killing? I mean, it's just amazing. The figures, 8 people every day kill themselves, 6 of them are men.
It's terrifying.
It's just shocking. And it's all very convenient. There's a whole narrative out there saying it's all because men won't talk about their feelings. I mean, I did a video recently with a rural expert. She's an expert in something to do with crops and chemicals, but she had 2 men killed themselves in her part of Queensland where she lives, and she wrote a blog about how her experience of male suicide is very different from what you'll hear about. And she said it was total bullshit to say it's all about men not conveying their feelings. And she talked about what she sees as the real reason, namely the reasons that actually show up in all the research that everyone's ignoring, which is mainly about relationship breakup. That's the major cause that actually emerges in the research, because with relationship breakup comes often loss of, not only loss of their homes, but loss of their children, sometimes, very often now, false allegations of violence, losing, a whole range of consequences, huge financial consequences, and all of that stuff. And she says, particularly in her rural community, you've got a bloke having to go to court facing a false allegation of violence, and he has to travel. He can't even leave his farm to travel to the magistrate. So, he can't. He drives 1,000 miles to see his kids. Mum says, no, you can't see them today. I mean, all that stuff. And she wrote really well about all of that. And it's exactly what people don't want to hear. We have good data in Australia showing that connection. The major group at risk of suicide in Australia are men in their 30s and 40s, are family men, and particularly men who lose their families. And no one wants to acknowledge that. We have a national suicide prevention strategy released this year, which is gender neutral. It doesn't mention men. I mean, how outrageous is that? It doesn't talk about any specific strategies that apply to men. It doesn't mention this evidence on the major cause of suicide, which is relationship breakup. We just had our federal government just appointed a national suicide spokesperson. I can't remember what her title is. She's a mental health expert, and she's been talking about Indigenous groups. She's been talking about veterans. She's talked about the other day she was out talking about people from foreign language speakers and needing translators. She's talking about every group except this huge elephant in the room, which is ordinary blokes. They're the people who are killing themselves.
How? This is everywhere. This is not just Australia. This is the UK.
Across the
this
world.
Is America.
And everywhere the authorities are lying about this.
How? Why? Is it to fill that role, as you said, with the gender neutral thing? It's to fill that role that we need in government. Government officials cannot speak out and try and segregate people by sex, because that is seen as sexist.
Well,
why do they get this
but
attention?
I do, of course, in domestic violence, the figures are actually not nearly as bad in terms of disproportion. No question, our official statistics show at least a third of victims of domestic violence are male. And yet the whole policymakers' argument is most victims are female, and therefore we will give all the money to women. There is not a single government-funded refuge for male victims of domestic violence and their kids. Wow. There is nowhere for men to go when they're in a violent situation with a woman. If they ring the police, they're often told to man up, told, we can't do anything to help you. I mean, so that the figures there, so they use the fact that they're a disproportionately smaller group of men to deny any help for them, and yet tiny group of women successfully committing suicide, and yet that justifies a gender-neutral policy. I mean, this is just craziness, and this is because we have the whole of our bureaucracies now dominated by the feminist narrative. And when we have women who've graduated from gender study courses across Australia, who've been indoctrinated with feminist ideology in our universities, now running all our government institutions. 80%, something percent of the health departments in Australia are women, the bureaucrats in the health departments. You think that's not going to influence policy? They have no interest in doing anything for men. They have a huge interest in denying there is a male problem. They don't want to, it's about the cash cow. If you look at the domestic violence area, I mean, thousands and thousands of women are being employed to promote misinformation about domestic violence in Australia, because this is their big source, the feminists' big source of money, the money that Malcolm Turnbull boasted of spending hundreds of millions of dollars on domestic violence. Almost all that money went towards campaigns demonising men, pretending the domestic violence program, the whole problem is to do with male attitudes to women. You know, remember that horrible advertising campaign where they had a little boy slamming the door in the little girl's face? It's all about respect for women. That is a total lie. There is international research showing that internationally there is an issue of misogyny, of male attitudes to women, because if you include countries like Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan and hideous countries where men are really...
Which people won't talk about.
With prejudice against women and treat women very badly. If you include all those African countries, et cetera, you do get that showing up as an international trend. If you look at within that data at countries like Britain and America and Australia, it doesn't show up at all, because we're a very egalitarian country and there is no evidence whatsoever in Australia that is to do with respect for women. David Leyonhjelm, former federal senator, grilled the bureaucrats in Senate estimates, the committee that enables you to ask bureaucrats what they're spending money on. And he asked them, what's the justification for this campaign, this television campaign, demonising men, presenting domestic violence as being all about respect for women? And it's a very funny video if you've never seen it. They wriggle and squirm and we have to get back to you. And then they came back to him, whatever it was, X weeks later. They've got nothing. They produced those same international surveys that actually don't show it. That's the problem in Australia. And they had no data related to that, making that case in Australia.
There are a few videos online with David Leyonhjelm actually grilling.
Yeah, he did a terrific
He's done
job.
it a few times.
Oh no, he was fabulous. But see, that's the point. We have all our policies being tilted to favour women at the expense of men, to favour funding towards women's causes at the expense of men's causes. And that's why suicide is this absolute lie about what's happening with regard to suicide in Australia.
I think with men, and what you said is very true, men are out there, they're speaking about mental health. I think in a lot of groups they don't do it as much, perhaps across the board, particularly from a football background like me. No one's having those conversations. It's starting to happen, but from when I played, I never heard anyone mention any of that type of stuff. It was more whispers about people in a bad situation. As I've left and I've moved on with things I'm doing in my life, I have spoken to former players who had issues that they were dealing with during that time. And it's good that people are talking about that. And we do a lot of, on this podcast and with my channel, we talk a lot about that type of stuff. And it's amazing the people that come up who do, perhaps after a show or whatever, and say, listen, you've really helped my life and all that type of stuff. And that's awesome. It's good to have people with the power of reach on the internet talking to people in their homes, making sure that they know that if they're not right, then they need to go out and they need to talk to a professional. Yeah. They need to make sure.
Are you okay, mate? All those sort of campaigns.
All those campaigns.
I think they're terrific.
Fantastic.
And get men to, of course it's important for men to talk more.
But the fact that there is so much going into mental health, the mental health space, but it's not gender-based. When there's this obviously disproportionate amount of men killing themselves on a daily basis, as you said, out of 8, 6 of them are men, there's 2 women. Why would there not be so much more put in to that male group. And it's one point that I always point to is there's so much demonization of men. Men are the enemy. From a young age, women are taught this. And, you know, as you said, with the bureaucrats and these government officials now pushing this narrative everywhere. It's on the TV, on the news, the Project, the ABC's talking about it. Men are getting pushed up against the wall. They freak out. They don't know what to do.
Yeah.
They're either going to curl into a ball or retaliate, which are both bad options. And I think that this whole thing, and the best way that we can sort of deal with all the misinformation, all the
whatever that
Connor,
was.
hit me with that word. Misinterpretation of the data that is out there. I think the only way we can deal with that is to go out of our way to combat that with the correct speech and the speech that is based by scientific data. And I think that's what you are doing. And I think that is a very important thing to